70-ton granite beams, hauled almost 800 kilometers from Aswan, still hang over the king's chamber like frozen thunder. In the hot dust around the Great Pyramid and the Sphinx of Giza, that number is the first problem, because the whole structure weighs roughly 6 million tons, built from about 2.3 million blocks, and it does not behave like a pile of ancient rubble. It behaves like something planned. That is where the question starts to get uncomfortable. Not who admired it, not who buried it in it, but how did anyone move stone that heavy, place it that tight, and keep the geometry so clean that modern builders still stare at it in silence? The surface tells one story, the mass tells another, and the place itself keeps refusing the easy answer. Then the focus shifts to the Sphinx enclosure, where the stone walls show a different kind of evidence. Robert Schoch looked at the vertical weathering and argued it points to long exposure to heavy rain, not just desert wind and sand. That matters because rain leaves a very specific signature on rock. Wind does one thing, water does another. And when the marks do not match the official timeline, the stone becomes a witness. Christopher Dunn found his own problem in the granite, measuring surfaces and drill marks that looked far too precise for simple copper tools. A physical reading of the stone. So now, the same site is giving up two different contradictions at once. Weathering that looks too old and workmanship that looks too advanced. And just below that, scanners started reporting cavities near the Sphinx, while exploration kept getting shut down. If the answers are really that close to the surface, why does the ground keep staying closed? Subscribe if you want the next piece of the chain. And that is where the ground itself starts to matter more than the skyline. Around the Sphinx, the air is dry, the limestone pale, the trench walls rough under a hand. But those walls look old and worked on by the wrong kind of time. Schoch's argument was not about legend or symbolism. It was about water erosion weathering. Deep vertical channels, rounded surfaces, patterns that fit prolonged rainfall far better than sand-laden wind. In a desert plateau, that is not a small difference. It is the difference between late dynastic monument and something standing there long before the accepted date. Once that idea enters the frame, the whole site changes shape. The Great Pyramid and the Sphinx of Giza look less like a single neat chapter and more like layers from different ages pressed together. One line of evidence comes from the enclosure walls. Another comes from the stonework above. Christopher Dunn's precision machining argument does not prove a lost civilization by itself. He presents it as an engineering problem. But placed beside the erosion debate, it sharpens the tension. Two different materials, two different methods, one result. The official story starts to strain. And then a third line appears below the sand. Seismic teams and ground radar surveys, working in different years with different tools, reported anomalies near the monument. Spaces, edges, voids. Measurable returns. Enough to raise the possibility of a sealed subsurface chamber. So here is the problem. If the weathering suggests one timeline, the granite suggests another level of capability, and the subsurface scans suggest hidden architecture, why does every path toward verification seem to stop right before the door? That pattern becomes harder to dismiss once the timeline of the scans is laid side by side. In the years after the first anomaly reports, the sand around the Sphinx was photographed, guessed at, and tested again. Different crews, different equipment, different signal behavior coming back through the limestone and packed ground. Seismic readings suggested one thing. Ground radar suggested the same thing. A void is not a legend. it shows up as a break, a return, a shape where solid stone should be. And near that monument, the returns kept hinting at cavities with edges too clean to ignore. Now pause on that for a second. One team can be mistaken. Two teams can be argued with. But when multiple teams, multiple methods, one result keeps circling the same patch of ground, the burden shifts. The question is no longer, did someone imagine a chamber? The question becomes, why was follow-up treated like a threat? Requests to open the area, even in a limited and careful way, kept running into the same wall. Delay, refusal, caution, silence. And that silence matters because this place is already full of measured contradictions. The enclosure may carry the marks of water erosion weathering. The pyramid may preserve signs Dunn reads as precision machining. Beneath the plateau, instruments point to hidden space. 3 tracks of evidence, and each one leads to the same narrow corridor. Almost enough access to prove something, never enough to settle it. If that were the only closed path, maybe it could be called caution. But inside the Great Pyramid, another search was already moving through stone dust, dim light, and a shaft barely wide enough for a machine to breathe. And what it reached was not an open passage. That second closed path ran inside the pyramid itself, where the air is stale, the stone is cool to the touch, and every sound comes back thin and metallic. In the early 1990s, Rudolf Gantenbrink sent a small robot named Upuat into one of the narrow shafts leading out from the so-called Queen's Chamber. It crawled forward on tracks through a passage too tight for a person, carrying lights and a camera into darkness no human eye had properly seen. Dust clung to the shaft walls. The image shook. Then the machine reached something no one expected to see at the end of such a tunnel. A fitted limestone slab, cleanly set, with 2 copper fittings protruding from its face. That changed the mood of the whole discussion. A rough blockage would have looked accidental. This did not. It looked placed, deliberate, functional, or at least symbolic in a way that made no sense if the shaft was only a vent. And remember, this is inside the same monument where Dunn saw signs he interpreted as precision machining, inside the same complex where the ground near the Sphinx had already suggested hidden voids. Different locations, same pattern. The place keeps ending in barriers. Gantenbrink asked for permission to continue the investigation, to examine what lay beyond that slab. And that is where the pattern hardened again. Access narrowed. Progress slowed. The shaft remained only partly explored. So now, there were anomalies above ground, below ground, and inside the core of the structure itself. If this was all ordinary architecture, why did it keep producing sealed endings? And if that copper-fitted slab was not the end of the passage, what exactly was it trying to separate? That question gets sharper when the shaft is treated not as a mystery prop, but as an engineering feature. For years, those narrow passages were casually described as air shafts. That sounds neat, until the details start pushing back. The channels from the so-called Queen's Chamber were not open in the simple way a ventilation system should be. They were tight, hidden, and ended in fitted stone. In a place where every inch of space took labor to cut, that matters. Nobody carves long internal passages through solid masonry for no reason, then caps them with a carefully placed slab and copper fittings as if function suddenly stopped a few inches from completion. Inside the monument, that detail changes the feeling of the whole interior. The walls are silent, the air tastes dry, and the beam of a camera sliding through the shaft picks out tool marks, dust, and angles that seem too intentional to dismiss. Dunn's precision machining claims sit in the background here, not as proof, but as pressure. If the stonework was more exact than expected, then the blocked shaft may also belong to a design logic we no longer understand. And notice the pattern again. At the Sphinx, instruments hint at a sealed subsurface chamber and access stalls. In the enclosure, Robert Schoch argues the water erosion weathering points to a much older phase of construction. In the pyramid, a robot reaches a barrier where a passage should continue. Different evidence, different methods, one result. The site does not open cleanly. It stops just short. So the shaft matters so much. If it was symbolic, why seal it? If it was practical, practical for what? And if the first slab was not the end of the design, what would a camera see if it ever got more than a few inches past it? For a while, that first slab sat there like a held breath in stone. Then the interior of the pyramid gave up one more detail, not enough to answer anything, just enough to make the blockage worse. A later robotic inspection was finally allowed to approach the fitted slab more aggressively. Tiny drill, camera probe, controlled movement, harsh white light on dusty limestone. The hole was small, the risk was minimal, and what the camera saw beyond it was not an open shaft leading neatly onward. There was a short cavity, and then another barrier. That is the kind of detail that changes a curiosity into a pattern. One sealed point can be dismissed as odd design. Two in sequence are harder to wave away. Inside this monument, behind a carefully placed slab with copper fittings, a narrow gap opened onto yet another stone closure, another stopping point, another deliberate finish where a passage seems to promise continuation. Now, set that beside everything already on the table. Schoch argues that the enclosure carries water erosion weathering that does not fit the standard age. Dunn argues some internal stone surfaces and drill traces suggest precision machining beyond the accepted toolkit. Subsurface surveys near the Sphinx report cavities, yet access stalls. And inside the pyramid, a robot reaches one closed slab, then a second. Different domains, geology, engineering, remote sensing, internal exploration. Same result. The site does not simply hide its past. It appears compartmentalized. So the question shifts again. Not just who built it or when, but why so many controlled endings? Why design spaces that can be approached, measured, even pierced, but not easily entered? And once that question is asked, even the alignment of the whole plateau starts to feel less decorative than it first appears. That alignment starts to matter once the site is treated as a whole, not as two separate monuments. The Great Pyramid and the Sphinx of Giza do not sit randomly on the plateau. Their placement, their sightlines, and the way the major structures face across the ground all invite comparison. So the Orion correlation idea keeps coming back into the conversation, even among people who do not fully accept it. It is not a claim of proof by itself. It is a pattern claim. The layout seems to mirror something above, and once you notice it, the entire complex starts to feel deliberate on a larger scale. But here is the hard part. Deliberate for whom? And when? If the ground plan was built to match the sky, then the builders were not just placing stones. They were thinking in time, in angles, in cycles. That means the old "it was just a tomb complex" explanation gets thinner, because tombs do not need this kind of cosmic framing. A tomb can be sealed, a machine can be tuned. That is where the evidence chain tightens again. Schoch gives the site an older geological horizon. Dunn gives it a technical horizon. The alignment arguments give it a celestial horizon. 3 angles, 1 place. And every time the search gets closer to an answer, the access narrows. The sealed openings, the denied excavations, the partial shafts, the still unopened spaces. So if the plateau was designed as more than a burial ground, then what was it supposed to do? Mark a date? Preserve a memory? Point to something the builders expected future generations to recognize? and maybe never quite would? That larger design question becomes harder to avoid when the sky is brought back into the picture. The plateau does not just hold mass, it holds orientation. The faces of the Great Pyramid are famously aligned with extreme accuracy, and once that is accepted as intentional, the Orion correlation stops sounding like a casual visual trick and starts sounding like a timing problem. Because if a layout on the ground reflects a layout in the sky, then the builders were tracking more than direction. They were tracking position across long spans of time. And time is where the official story begins to wobble again. Robert Bauval argued that the pattern of the major pyramids makes better sense against an older sky than the usual dynastic date allows. Whether one accepts his conclusion or not, the structure of the argument matters. It is not, these stars look kind of similar. It is geometry, offset, angle, relative placement. In other words, the same kind of measurable comparison that keeps surfacing at this site in stone, in erosion, in subsurface returns, in shaft architecture. Now put that beside the rest. Schoch looks at the enclosure and sees a climate signature older than expected. Dunn looks at granite and sees workmanship he reads as beyond simple hand methods. Gantenbrink's robot finds a sealed route where a simple vent should have been. Bauval looks upward and says the ground plan may be echoing a much older celestial arrangement. 4 lines, different disciplines, 1 pressure point. So what happens if the site was built to preserve a date in the sky as well as a message in stone? And if that date points back beyond the accepted beginning of Egyptian civilization, who exactly was leaving the marker? That possibility changes the role of the later Egyptians in a very uncomfortable way. Because once the geology, the hidden spaces, the blocked shafts, and the sky alignment arguments are all on the table, the old assumption quietly flips. Instead of asking whether dynastic Egypt created the whole complex from scratch, some researchers ask a different question. What if it inherited part of it? Not built every core feature, but found, repaired, reused, reinscribed, and folded it into a later sacred landscape. In that model, the monuments remain Egyptian in history and stop being Egyptian in origin. And that matters because it explains something the site has always done to people who study it closely. The outer story feels familiar: kings, burials, ritual, state power. But the inner details keep slipping away from that frame. The inaccessible shafts do not behave like simple ceremony. The possible sealed subsurface chamber near the Sphinx does not behave like empty bedrock. The scale of transport and placement does not behave like an ordinary prestige project. Every time the place is treated as settled, one more physical fact pushes it back open. Christopher Dunn's readings of the stone sit right in the middle of that tension. He does not have to prove an entire vanished civilization for his measurements to matter. If the surfaces and drill marks really suggest a level of control beyond the accepted toolkit, then reuse becomes more plausible. A later culture can inherit what it did not originate. So now the argument is about sequence. Which parts belong to the first builders, and which parts belong to those who came later, named it, sealed it, and perhaps never fully understood it themselves. And if that is true, then the next thing to ask is not what the pharaohs put inside, but what was already there before them. That possibility opens another door, and this one is not in the floor or the shaft walls. It is in the chamber itself. Stand inside the king's chamber for a moment in your mind. Granite all around, hard surfaces, low, dry air. A room that does not swallow sound so much as hold it, then send it back altered. Above the ceiling sit those immense beams from Aswan, stacked there with a confidence that still feels almost impolite. This is where the monument stops feeling purely symbolic and starts feeling technical. Because a chamber like that does not only have dimensions, it has behavior. Researchers who focus on the interior have pointed out that the room responds to vibration in ways that seem unusually controlled. That does not prove some lost machine, and it should not be exaggerated. But it does deepen the problem. If this was only a burial space, why give so much attention to mass, shape, and stone choice in one sealed core room? Why place colossal granite elements overhead where most visitors would never even understand their significance? Why make the heart of the structure feel less like decoration and more like a tuned cavity? Now, lay that beside the rest of the complex. Outside, the Sphinx enclosure raises the age question through erosion. Below the sand, scans hint at hidden voids. In the shafts, barriers appear where simple passages should continue. In the granite, Dunn sees possible precision machining. And in the central chamber, the architecture behaves less like a memorial box and more like something designed to manage force. So the puzzle is changing shape again. Maybe the real secret of this place is not only what is buried there, but what the structure itself was built to do when it was whole. If that central chamber had a purpose beyond burial, then the surrounding architecture starts to look less ornamental and more like support structure. Think about the layering. Massive outer body, internal corridors that change angle for no obvious ceremonial reason, chambers that sit not at the geometric center, but where load, force, and access all become complicated at once. Above the king's chamber, those granite relieving blocks are usually explained as simple weight management. And of course, they do carry weight. But even that plain explanation leaves a strange aftertaste. Why solve pressure in such a labor-intensive way, unless what sits below those beams matters more than we have been told? This is where the site becomes difficult to reduce. A tomb theory explains some features. An engineering theory explains others. Neither one, by itself, settles the whole picture. Dunn's precision machining argument presses on the stone surface. Schoch's age argument presses on the enclosure outside. The shaft barriers press on intent. Bouval's sky model presses on design logic. And the chamber presses on function. Different pressure points, same discomfort. The official frame covers the outline, but not the weight of the details. Now add one more problem. If later Egyptians reused an older core, they may have preserved forms whose original meaning had already faded. That would explain why some elements feel practical without a clear practical use, and sacred without a clear symbolic key. It would also explain the strange mix of confidence and silence around the place, as if the builders knew exactly what they were doing and the inheritors knew only that it should not be altered too freely. Once that possibility is allowed, the hidden spaces near the Sphinx stop looking like side mysteries. They start looking like part of the same buried system. And once they are seen that way, the denials stop feeling like isolated decisions and start looking like part of the evidence. Near the Sphinx, the buried anomalies were never just a rumor whispered over postcards and guidebooks. Instruments touched that ground. Signals went down through dust, fractured limestone, packed layers, and came back with interruptions that suggested voids where there should have been continuity. Repeated surveys across different years kept pointing to the same uncomfortable possibility: a cavity, maybe more than one. Something under the monument that does not belong to a simple natural crack. If that were all, caution would be reasonable. But caution is one thing. A recurring stop pattern is another. Requests to investigate were narrowed, delayed, or refused. Access inside the pyramid stalled at fitted slabs and second barriers. Access under the Sphinx stalled at scan results and permission walls. That is why the site feels so charged to people who study it seriously. Not because every claim is proven, but because the physical trail keeps ending in the same administrative shadow. Now the separate threads begin to pull together. Schoch presses on age. Dunn presses on workmanship. Boval presses on orientation. Gantenbrink presses on hidden architecture. The subsurface surveys press on buried volume. Different specialists, different tools, one result. The accepted story remains intact only if each anomaly is kept in its own box and never allowed to speak to the others. But what if they do belong to one design? What if the shafts, the chamber, the exterior layout, and the hidden spaces near the Guardian statue were all parts of a single plan, built in stages, sealed in stages, and misunderstood in stages? Because the moment that possibility is taken seriously, the next question becomes far more dangerous than how old is it? It becomes, what was worth hiding under the sand for this long? That question becomes even heavier when the buried spaces are imagined not as treasure rooms, but as storage for continuity. A chamber under the Guardian statue, if one exists in the way the scans suggest, would not have to be huge to matter. A small dry void in limestone can change history if what sits inside it is deliberate. Tools, records, fragments, sealed containers, even architectural instructions. And that is why the repeated refusals matter so much. The problem is not only that access was denied, it is that the denials happened after instruments had already pointed to something measurable in the ground. Now, the whole plateau starts to split into two stories. One is the public story: kings, tombs, dynasties, symbols. The other is the physical story: weathering older than expected, interior barriers where simple passages should continue, workmanship Dunn reads as unexpectedly advanced, and underground returns that keep hinting at hidden volume. Those two stories overlap, but they do not sit comfortably together. If the place really was reused, then a buried chamber would make perfect sense. Later caretakers do not need to understand every original function to preserve what they fear damaging. In fact, that may explain the strange tension around the site better than any grand theory. Something colder. Institutional caution protecting a story that already feels unstable. And once that frame settles in, the shafts inside the pyramid look different again. They stop seeming like isolated curiosities and start looking like controlled access points in a larger system. Some below the sand, some within the masonry, some never fully entered. So the next step is obvious. And that is exactly what makes it dangerous. If the hidden spaces form a network rather than separate accidents, where does that network actually begin? That question points away from treasure and toward catastrophe. If a buried network exists beneath this plateau, then the logic of hiding changes. You do not seal ordinary things with that much care. You do not place barriers inside narrow shafts, leave suspected voids under a guardian monument, and build core chambers with this much structural intention just to protect routine objects. You do it when the contents matter beyond one lifetime, maybe beyond one kingdom. And that is where the age problem becomes something larger than chronology. Schoch's reading of the enclosure pushes the site back toward a wetter world, an actual one, where prolonged rain could mark limestone in a way desert wind would not. If he is even partly right, then this complex belongs, at least in origin, closer to the long climatic transition at the end of the last ice age than to the neat dynastic timeline usually given to visitors. Now think about what that implies on the ground. A civilization facing radical environmental change would preserve differently from a civilization at peace. It would prioritize what must survive flood, collapse, abandonment, memory loss. Stone over paper, hidden chambers over exposed libraries, encoded alignments over spoken tradition. In that light, the Orion correlation idea, the blocked shafts, the chamber behavior, and the buried anomalies stop feeling like separate oddities. They begin to resemble a continuity strategy. That does not prove a vanished high civilization in one stroke. It does something more unsettling. It makes the whole site legible as an answer to a crisis we can only partly reconstruct. So if this place was built, reused, and sealed across eras shaped by environmental shock, then maybe the most important question is no longer who built it first. Maybe it is what they were trying to preserve from the end of their own world. Once that possibility is on the table, the site stops being only an archaeological argument and starts becoming a warning system, a stone warning, slow, patient, difficult to erase. If the builders of the earliest phase faced a world changing faster than their institutions could hold together, then what survives here may be the minimum package of knowledge they believed must outlast them. Orientation, mass, sealed space, and encoded relationships between sky and ground. Not a spoken message, a durable one. That is why the mix of evidence feels so strange. Geological age indicators do not usually end up next to hidden internal barriers. Suspected sealed chambers do not usually sit beside architecture that seems overbuilt for ritual alone. And yet here, on the same plateau, every path keeps converging. The water erosion weathering argument pushes the monuments backward in time. The workmanship argument pushes them upward in technical expectation. The subsurface readings push them downward into hidden volume. The sky model arguments push them outward into long cycles. 4 directions, 1 pressure. If this were only a date dispute, scholars would fight and move on. But this is heavier than that. Because if the place was designed to survive a civilizational break, then the survival of the structure itself becomes part of the message. It means someone expected memory to fail. And memory does fail. Names change. Functions get reassigned. Sacred places are reused. A machine becomes a shrine. A warning becomes a myth. A chamber becomes nothing important, because opening it would force every comfortable label to be tested against stone. So maybe the deepest silence around this plateau is not about embarrassment over old dates. Maybe it is about the fear that the buried answer would sound uncomfortably modern and far too familiar. That familiarity is what makes the whole thing turn from mystery into dread. Because once the plateau is read as a response to collapse, every feature changes tone. The massive stone no longer looks like vanity alone. The hidden voids no longer look like curiosities. The sealed barriers no longer feel decorative. They begin to look like a civilization trying to outrun forgetting. And perhaps trying to outrun physical destruction as well. That is why the argument over dates is almost the least important part now. Yes, the timing matters. If Schoch is right, the enclosure reaches back into a very different climate. If Bouval is even partly right, the layout may preserve a sky reference older than dynastic Egypt. If Dunn is even partly right, some finishing work exceeds the simple tool picture. But taken together, those claims do not just push the site earlier, they push it into a new category, a remnant of people planning for discontinuity. And discontinuity is not abstract. On this plateau, it would mean flood, migration, loss of records, loss of language, loss of function. A later culture could inherit the stone and keep the reverence, while losing the manual. That would explain the strange split the site still carries. Perfect confidence in execution, deep uncertainty in interpretation. Now step back and look at the emotional geometry of the place. Above ground, overwhelming permanence. Inside, controlled passages and stoppages. Below ground, suspected cavities. Around it all, a repeated refusal to test the most dangerous questions cleanly. Not because every answer is known, but because opening one verified space might force all the other anomalies into the same frame at once. And if that happened, if one chamber, one shaft, one buried cavity linked the whole pattern together, the argument would stop being about the past. It would become about whether advanced societies can disappear more completely than we want to believe. And that is the point where the monument stops looking old and starts looking current. Because everything unsettling about this plateau depends on one simple possibility: that a sophisticated society can lose not just power, but context. It can leave stone and lose explanation. It can leave alignment and lose the astronomy that framed it. It can leave engineered spaces and lose the reason those spaces were engineered at all. The Great Pyramid and the Sphinx of Giza may be standing proof that endurance of material is not the same thing as endurance of meaning, so the denied access matters so much. If one of those buried voids or blocked passages were opened cleanly and found to be empty, fine, one line of speculation would collapse. But if one of them were opened and found to contain records, tools, or design clues linking age, function, and sky pattern into one coherent system, then the intellectual shock would be enormous. Because it would force a rewrite grounded in stone, measurement, and sequence. And notice how narrow the whole problem has become. Not did people in the past know things? Of course they did. Not are all accepted chronologies false? That is too crude. The real question is smaller and more dangerous. Did one early culture on this site preserve technical and symbolic knowledge across a civilizational break, and did later Egypt inherit the shell of that system? If the answer is no, the puzzle shrinks. If the answer is yes, then this place is not merely a tomb field. It is a handoff. And handoffs are made only when someone believes they may not be there to explain the message in person. So what did they think was coming? Badly enough to build memory into the stone itself. So the final shape of the mystery is a chain that refuses to break. On one side of the plateau, stone walls carry marks Robert Schoch reads as rain from a climate older than the accepted date. In the heart of the pyramid, granite surfaces and drill traces led Christopher Dunn to argue for a level of control hard to square with the standard tool story. Under the sand, repeated scans kept hinting at voids near the guardian figure, yet access stalled. In the shafts, Gantenbrink's robot reached a fitted slab, then a second stop beyond it. Different locations, different instruments, different disciplines. One stubborn result. The site keeps presenting structure where the official picture expects simplicity. That does not force one grand conclusion. It forces one honest admission. The pair on that plateau may not be fully understood by the civilization that inherited them, studied them, fenced them, photographed them, and explained them. A monument can remain visible and still go unread. A sealed room does not have to be opened to cast a shadow. Sometimes the locked shape of it is enough. By dusk, the limestone loses its glare and turns the color of old bone. The wind moves loose grit along the ground in thin, dry threads, and the openings that were never fully entered go dark, one by one. Nothing announces itself. Nothing resolves. The stone simply keeps its posture. Maybe that is the real warning here. Not that the past was magical, or that every forbidden chamber hides a final answer. Only that a culture can measure the stars, move mountains, carve memory into rock, and still leave behind a future that no longer knows how to ask the right questions. Night reaches the plateau slowly. The barriers remain where they were. And under all that weight, the unanswered parts do not feel buried at all. They feel patient.